Once you enter menopause, you don't exit menopause. But the biggest misconception is that you can't do anything about it.
Today, we discuss the consequences of menopause. My guests are talking sex and sleep, and they're not holding back. My first guest is Dr. Kameelah Phillips, a Stanford-trained, board-certified gynecologist and lifelong women's health advocate. Through unfiltered advice, she helps women live to the fullest during every life stage.
The vagina is like an ocean, and she's just waving and flowing. As we get into menopause, those waves start to become more shallow because of decreased estrogen.
Is sexual intimacy often affected during perimenopause and menopause?
Yes. I ask questions like, what's sex like these days? I see it as a measure of your quality of life. If they start to lose it, it seeps into the relationship.
She's joined by Dr. Sarah Berry. Sarah is Associate Professor of Nutrition at King's College London and Chief Scientist at ZOE.
About 45% of women say that their symptoms are so severe it impacts their quality of life. You have estrogen receptors all over your body. This is why these symptoms are so burdensome and so widespread. Sleep disturbances, brain fog, anxiety, hot flushes.
It sounds like menopause has to be a negative experience.
No. I love menopause. This is a time where I'm like, girlfriend, let's get selfish. Let's take back time to invest in ourselves. Is it a workout? Is it reading a book at night? Menopause has such a bad rap, but it doesn't mean that it has to be a terrible experience.
Welcome to ZOE, Science and Nutrition, where world-leading scientists explain how their research can improve your health. Kameelah, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And Sarah, thank you for joining as well.
Excited as always, Jonathan.
And this is especially exciting because straight after this, Kameelah is off to deliver a baby. And there is a danger that there might be a phone call. So I know I have to be more efficient than usual in case I don't get to the end and suddenly you're off. So Kameelah, we have a tradition here at ZOE where we always start with a quick fire round of questions from our listeners.
Oh, gosh.
And you have to give us a yes or a no, or if you absolutely have to, you can have a one-sentence answer.
Okay, absolutely. I'm going to try and stick with yes or no.
Brilliant. Are most women properly prepared for menopause before going through it?
No.
Is sexual intimacy often affected during perimenopause and menopause?
Yes.
Is sleep negatively affected by menopause?
Yes.
Sarah, can these changes lead to a change in your weight?
Yes.
Are there unfavorable changes in your metabolism during perimenopause and menopause?
Yes.
Okay. Kameelah, it sounds like menopause has to be a negative experience?
No.
Just finally, you get a whole sentence now.
I know, you see I'm holding it in.
A whole sentence now. What do you think is the biggest misconception around menopause?
I think because menopause has such a bad rap, it's because we're not prepared. We didn't talk to our mom and our grandmother. The biggest misconception is that you can prepare for menopause. You can prepare your body, your mind, your family, your job, loved ones. So I think that's the biggest misconception, that we should be preparing for menopause.
As someone running a company that does a lot of data science, here's something that fascinates me. YouTube has been telling me that 69.3% of you who watch this channel frequently haven't yet hit the subscribe button. So I want to ask you a quick favor. You choosing to subscribe helps us a lot. It helps us make the show better, access world-leading experts, and ultimately make more progress on our mission to improve the health of millions. So if you enjoy this show, all I ask is that you hit the subscribe button. And in return, I promise we'll continue to make this show better and better each week. I love that. And also love the way that you said, like, your mother and your grandmother never talked about it, because, you know, it's something that I always say whenever we're discussing menopause, was that, you know, my mother went through it and she never said anything about it, not a single word. And I discussed it with her afterwards. She's like, oh, well, you know, I didn't have it that badly. But she's also very British. So, you know, I'm not sure that I really believe this. So I don't know what to say. So I actually love that actually people are discussing it a lot more. But I'm really struck. I had always assumed that, like, I'm a man and that's why I never heard about it. But actually, you know, my sister was hearing about everything about this from, you know, my mother. Like, no, nothing whatsoever. So that is a big change. Maybe just, to start at the beginning for anyone who hasn't really been talking about this at all, could you just start, like, what is menopause? When does it start? And I think people are increasingly aware of this terminology, perimenopause.
Yeah.
Could you just put that together for us?
I completely can. So the quick and dirty is that menopause is 1 year after your last period. Okay. It lasts for the rest of your life. So once you enter menopause, you don't exit menopause. Menopause is the 1 year after your last period.
Like Hotel California.
It's check in, check out. You are checked in. And I say that because sometimes people occasionally will have a period and they're just like, oh, I'm having periods again. And that's actually a red flag. You need to see your doctor. The time before that is what we call perimenopause. So that's the 5 to 8 years before that last period. And it gives you signals. Periods start to change, maybe your metabolism, mood, sleep, early things, which is really important to take note of and start talking to your doctor about it. But perimenopause is that 5 to 8 years before the actual last year of no period. And then that next day, you are officially in menopause for the rest of your life.
And I think, Jonathan, a way to think about perimenopause is this state of hormonal chaos. It's not that you suddenly have this nice, gradual decline in estrogen, which is the hormone that declines during the menopause. It fluctuates. So, this is why some of the symptoms day to day can be so variable. So it's that hormonal chaos that's really burdensome.
Mm-hmm. And it usually shows up, first of all, in your menstrual cycle. So if you start seeing changes in your menstrual cycle, that should be a clue that you want to start thinking more broadly about what's going on in your life and your health. And in this country, the United States, the average age of last period is about 51. That can vary in other countries, vary based on your family history. I often tell women, they ask, when's my last period? And I don't know. Ask your mom. Ask your aunts. Though that can give you a little bit of insight to what you might experience, but in this country, it's 51.
And I understand there's no really reliable test during perimenopause to really understand even necessarily whether you're in perimenopause or certainly where you are. Is that accurate?
Very accurate. And that's the chaos that you're talking about. At any point, we can check labs, and I see a lot of commercial tests coming out. Not really that helpful. Now, I always have a discussion with patients. They come in, they say, I want to check my labs. I want to see where I am in my perimenopause or menopause. And I think there's a lot of resistance with doctors sometimes to do that. At this point in my career, I'm like, let's check them so we can have a discussion about them. But because they fluctuate so much, you should probably expect them to probably be normal.
I want to come back to that question that we had at the beginning about, are most women educated about menopause by the time they start coming to you with symptoms?
Are they educated? They've done some online research. They know something's going on. And usually what they do is they come in and they say, my periods are going away, or they're crazy. I'm not sleeping well. What is up with this 20 pounds? I can't get it off. And I'm like, say the word. Say it. Go ahead, say it. And then I finally get them to say, or they come up with perimenopause, maybe a little bit of denial.
Because they don't really want.
Because it's unknown, it's foreign. It can be very distressing unless you have someone to sort of guide you through it. But eventually, in saying it, I think that you take back some of the mystery and the power that gets released when you don't really know what to expect with your body or what's going on. And it sets the stage for our future conversations and engagement.
And it feels to me that although people are definitely talking about it more now than, even a decade ago, it's something that more than half of the human population goes through and is sort of unavoidable. It remains incredibly taboo and under discussed.
Yeah.
Why is that at a time when it feels like we sort of talk about almost everything else?
Yeah, I'm going to take a little responsibility for that. And by that, I mean our medical training. And our medical system, we spend so little time, first of all, on just women-specific issues, that when you really start to niche down all the things that can happen in the female body, maybe residents get 2 to 3 lectures on menopause, if that. And
2 to 3 lectures in their entire time of training to be a doctor.
Yeah, in their entire, maybe med school training, and then you have to go to residency to be an OBGYN to get further teaching. So if you're an orthopedist, You're not learning about menopause, but we know that it affects women's bones and their fracture risk. If you are, a dermatologist, we know that there's issues with hair loss, skin changes, et cetera, but you're not getting those lectures. So I want to, for us, physicians take responsibility that we actually need to do better because we have a captive audience that then can go out and preach the gospel of menopause health and wellness.
And so that's if you're a gynecologist. I'm guessing that the underlying science, Sarah, is also part of why there's so little, education as a doctor around this, whether it's in the States or the UK or Australia or wherever.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the science is moving at the same pace that we're starting to talk about it. So we weren't doing any science on it. I've run 30 randomized controlled trials before starting the work that we've been doing at ZOE. I didn't recruit any females into these studies for various reasons, because women are more complicated to study. You have to think of their menstrual cycle. You have to think of whether they're peri, or postmenopausal. So women traditionally in science have been incredibly understudied. Never mind whether we've even studied the menopause transition. Fortunately, there's a lot more research going on in this area. And fortunately for us, we're leading a lot of this research at ZOE. And I think we will make great leaps in this area in the next decade. But we're really behind on this.
It's really interesting. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions, Kameelah, about menopause when people come in to see you?
That we don't have anything to do to help them with their symptoms, whether it's sleep or intimacy or just general, the weight gain, that we don't have ways to help them get through this, and we do. The other misconception is that it's all hormones. There are a lot of people who either have contraindications to hormones, family reasons, medical reasons, or just philosophically don't want to go that route. And that's not necessarily the case.
So this is about saying sort of estrogen replacement, HRT in the UK, that's the only thing you can do. Is that what you're saying? So people,
right.
And you're saying that is not
the case. Yeah, that there are options. And I think it deserves a conversation. Every person deserves a personalized, assessment of what their needs are and their risks are, and we go from there. So I think the biggest thing is that you can't do anything about it. And no, menopause is inevitable. If you're lucky enough to live old enough, you will experience menopause, but it doesn't mean that it has to be a terrible experience.
I think as well, it's so variable for every individual. So what your friend might be experiencing versus what you're experiencing is hugely variable. And this is why, again, I think it's something that we really struggle with because, naturally as human beings, we compare ourselves to our friends, and the people around us. And we know from our ZOE Predict research, where we looked at in many thousands of individuals at the prevalence of symptoms, the severity of symptoms. And although we see that about 80% of people have sleep disturbances, 70% of people have anxiety, brain fog, so forth. But actually the clusters of symptoms differ hugely from one person to the next and also vary from month to month as well.
And actually, Sarah, I'd love to talk a little bit about those studies. I know you're running some of the biggest studies on menopause in the world, which is very cool. And I know that those studies are showing that there's more going on than just sort of women have less estrogen. From your perspective, could you maybe describe these studies a little bit and sort of what you're seeing?
So from a research perspective, and it would be interesting to know from a clinical perspective if you also kind of categorize in this way, we think of menopause in terms of symptoms and we think of menopause in terms of the disease risk as well. So what we know is that when you go through the menopause, your estrogen declines, you have estrogen receptors all over your body. This is why these symptoms are so burdensome and so widespread. You have estrogen receptors in your brain, in your adipose, in your fat tissue, everywhere. And so that's why you have all of these variety symptoms. And there's about 36 different symptoms that have been classified. And we
36 symptoms?
Yes.
Okay, so it's quite complicated.
Yes. And we know that the most common ones, as I mentioned, are sleep disturbances, brain fog, anxiety, hot flushes, weight gain. We know that about 45% of women say that their symptoms are so severe it impacts their quality of life. And we're starting to understand a lot more about how different approaches can help attenuate, so reduce some of these symptoms. But I think something that's not talked about enough, and this is an area that we've also been doing research in at ZOE, is the increased disease risk that happens post-menopause. And this is something everyone that I speak to, I'm late 40s, I'm at that perimenopausal phase. Everyone's just so preoccupied with these awful burdensome symptoms that you're having at that time. But actually your risk of chronic disease goes up massively. And so what happens is when you transition to the postmenopausal phase, you have an increased blood pressure, you have increased circulating blood cholesterol, you have worse insulin sensitivity, so worse blood sugar control, you have increased inflammation, you have increased body fat around your waist, which we know is particularly harmful. And you also process your food very differently, which increases your risk of disease as well.
Can we talk about that for a minute? Because I know that's one of the areas where, this research you've been doing is just a much bigger scale than anyone has ever done before.
Yeah, so with our ZOE Predict study, where we had 1,100 individuals and we focused on something called postprandial metabolism. So that simply means post-meal metabolism, so how you process your foods. And we were particularly interested in looking at how people process sugar, carbohydrates, how they process fats. And we looked at the post-meal increases in circulating blood sugar, because we know that if it's excessive, repeated, it's associated with increased risk of many chronic diseases. We also looked at circulating blood fat from the fat that you eat in a meal, again, because we know that if it's excessive, it's associated with increased risk of many chronic diseases. And what we found was that postmenopausal women had higher levels of post-meal circulating blood sugar and post-meal circulating blood fat to a standard meal compared to premenopausal women. And we actually also looked at what about in age-matched individuals? Because menopause is an age-related event. And so it's really important to try and tease apart what's actually just part of the natural aging process. So, for example, we know men, as you age, you have an increased blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. And so in our study, because it was of such a scale, we were able to take a subgroup of individuals and age-match them, where half of them were premenopausal, half were postmenopausal but the same age. And we still saw these significant differences in these post-meal blood sugar levels, that the postmenopausal women were processing the blood sugar in an unfavorable way. So they were having these higher peaks in blood sugar after a meal.
Kameelah, I think Sarah's talked a lot about sort of this, the overall study in large population. I'm really interested in coming back to what that experience is for individual women. And so, if you describe these women coming in who maybe not even want to identify necessarily that it's perimenopause because it's sort of tied in with all of these things that sound really bad.
It also means we're getting old.
Yeah,
I'm not ready for this aging.
And actually, I was going to ask, what is that like, and what do you say to these women?
I talk to them about this being a time where they can really level set and look at their life and all the different aspects of their life and see where they can really work to be their best selves, to prepare them and prepare their family for the menopausal change. We talk about how exercise, is it or is it not a part of your life? What can we do to augment that? We talk about their food and their diet. We talk about rest and their mental health, reducing stress, these kind of things. So I sort of frame it as this being the beginning of the rest of your life, and more so in a positive way. What are the things that they're looking forward to? How can we augment their health throughout this menopausal transition so that they can reach their health goals and do better as it relates to cholesterol, diabetes, that kind of thing. And so in the mid-30s, I start talking to them about it. Hey, we might want to start thinking about your diet. How's your workout? Things like that we know are really about consistency, so they can have some tangible anticipatory guidance about conversations that are coming in the 40s.
And do you find that people are ready to embrace the fact that they are aging and they do need to think ahead to the future in their 30s? I wasn't.
I really
I'm
do.
still struggling.
No, listen, every day I'm like, oh, what are my knees going to do today? But I feel the same way. And I think it's because we're talking about it more. So it's no longer taboo when we bring up menopause, when we bring up intimacy. And I also present it in the office like, okay, what's sex like these days? And it just level sets that, this must be a regular conversation we have with people. And so there's no mystery about it. There's no hesitancy to jump right in and start talking about it. So I do find that they're pretty receptive.
One of the things that Sarah says is that science has tended not to measure anything about how people feel or sort of activities, anything that can't be like nicely measured with a really independent sort of blood test, sort of has historically not been viewed as maybe as valid. Is this fair, Sarah, what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. Until I started the ZOE'S studies, we never asked people how they felt. I mean, that's just wishy-washy in science. We want a biochemical marker, full stop. But what's really interesting is with all of our studies now, we're asking people, what's your energy like? What's your mood like? What's your hunger like? What's your alertness like? And general stuff about just how great they're feeling. And it's lovely how we're seeing with our own research this play out in many of our results.
It's important, right? I see it as a measure of your quality of life. I ask questions like, are you having an orgasm? How strong are they? Are you masturbating still?
Okay, we haven't started asking those at yet.
It's pace yourself, but it speaks to their quality of life. And intimacy ranks really high for some people. And so during the menopausal transition, if they start to lose it, then it seeps into the relationship. And how they feel.
I would say, can we talk directly about this? And you're quite right. We definitely haven't discussed this on the podcast. I mean, I'm English, so, I'm like treading very delicately into this phase.
I'll tread lightly too.
We don't talk about sex in England.
I know. I've heard that, but I don't
have it in England.
You just keep multiplying some magical way. I'll tread lightly too.
I actually think we should talk about it directly.
Okay.
I think it's interesting, though, that we don't tend to talk about it. It's clearly something that's very important for people. And I think, again, that comes back to this, it's not something you measure with biochemistry, and it's something, again, that people have historically felt is very taboo to discuss. Could you actually start with what kind of shifts do women experience in terms of their libido, and also what might be happening sort of physically that might affect intimacy? And then love for you to talk us through how you then respond to that.
So generally when I start to approach patients about intimacy, their love life, relationship, a lot of our conversation, to your point, Sarah, talks about how estrogen receptors are all over the body. And unlike our male counterparts, what is, in my opinion, our largest sexual organ, and it's this. I always am pointing to the female brain. When we start to experience lower levels of estrogen, it affects our brain, it affects our love centers, it affects our, highs and lows, and it also affects our vulva and vagina. And so as we enter perimenopause, menopause, I use the analogy sort of how the vagina is like an ocean and she's just waving and flowing. And that's usually what we see in adolescence, our 20s or 30s, a vagina that's well estrogenized and receptive to penetration, touch, that kind of thing. As we get into perimenopause and menopause, those waves start to become more shallow. The vaginal walls literally, under a microscope, literally become thinner and by that effect, inflamed. And so touch, penetration can become extremely painful.
This is as a consequence of the drop in estrogen?
Okay. Exactly, yes. And this has a huge effect on women. And it is because if you begin to set up a tract in your brain and body that sex is painful, it makes a signal to your brain that why am I doing that? This isn't fun. And then so you begin to avoid it more. And the vagina is it's a muscle. I tell my patients, we got to exercise it, use it or lose it. And so having regular touch, orgasm, blood flow to the area is important in maintaining vaginal health. Even using toys, vibration is exquisitely important for women, especially in the clitoral area, because our nerves, as they change, respond to vibration. So these are really important topics, specifically about intimacy and menopause that I have with patients.
Is there a huge impact as well by the fact that our body shape is changing, the fact that us women, we're tired because we're not sleeping well, so all of those other symptoms, the fact that we're feeling more anxious. So even if you weren't having those direct effects, then, a lot of women are just feeling rubbish about themselves and in themselves as well.
I mean, preach. This is 100% a part of the conversation because, again, our sexual organ is our brain. Mm-hmm. And so for many women, and I'm not going to generalize us all, right? But if we come home from a full day's work, We have children to feed. We have parents to care for. We have, bills to pay. The desire just goes down, 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 down. And so when we're talking about a woman about her intimacy, I often invite her partner to come, because this is not just an issue of decreased estrogen per se. It really is a psychological, social, economic, cultural conversation that needs to happen with women in terms of tackling libido.
Yeah, I mean, I hear lots of people around my age saying, well, all I want to do is sleep. I'm so exhausted. I just want to get into bed and I want to go to sleep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it becomes such a focus, I think, for a lot of perimenopausal women. When I said 8 out of 10 people who are not sleeping properly, that becomes all-consuming.
All-consuming, because it affects literally your entire day. And when you combine that with like brain fog or heaviness, weight gain, like it really becomes a time in your life that has the potential to really bring you down. And so that's why the anticipatory guidance early on helps us target some of these issues before they become problems.
Are there myths around intimacy for women through this that actually you would like to make sure we dispel?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd love to talk about, so what does that mean? What should women do? What might their partners be thinking about? Like, what are you recommending to your patients as a result?
So I think the big myth is that sex has to hurt. It doesn't. I think also another myth, and this is a little tricky because some women don't mind their decreased libido. They don't mind. It's a problem for their partner, not a problem for them. And then at that point, I just have to throw my hands up, because if it's not a problem for her, then it's kind of not a problem. But to the people who are having painful intercourse or want to do something about their libido, we absolutely can. There are probably 2, maybe 3, I won't mention any names, medications for women for libido. There's like 26, products for men. So there are things both on-label, off-label that I encourage people to talk about with their healthcare providers, because sex does not have to be painful. It can be very enjoyable, but it's just catching symptoms before they really get terrible.
Kameelah, in the UK, there's quite a lot of talk on social media about taking testosterone in order to improve libido. I don't think it's something that's encouraged at the moment by doctors in the UK. And I don't know what the perspective here is in the US and what you think about that. Is there evidence to support this?
There actually is evidence to support it. And the Menopause Society and some of our larger societies have come out with papers supporting the safe use of testosterone. These are topical forms that are about 1/10 of the 1% male dose, because again, we have all these options for men, very few for women. So we've had to adapt to the female body. There are protocols that allow us to use testosterone safely without the perceived negative side effects. We don't want your voice to change. We're not going to give you all these. So we can, yes, use it safely, but we are leaning away from methods that can give you super therapeutic levels of testosterone. For example, injections, pellets. That's not where we are. But there are testosterone options.
Is there anything else other than sort of medical treatment that you end up discussing when you're talking about these questions around intimacy?
Intimacy. Mm-hmm. I often give people a literal prescription to go to a sexual health store. And that is a time, there are several in the city. Hopefully people can find one near them. These are well-lit, clean stores, highly educated people who can coach you about toys and lubrications and fantasy, that type of thing that often resonates with female patients, because again, we're using our brain to drive our libido and sexuality. So it's not a light switch on and off. And so I have many of my patients go to adult stores and explore what fantasy that they haven't otherwise explored with their partner, and then introduce it.
And that's not like, oh, but it's during menopause, so that's all impossible. Because I think part of what I'm hearing from this is like, well, that's not going to work, because of this whole story that you're describing feels a bit, can feel a bit doom and gloom, Kameelah. But you're saying actually it's not as bad, that there's actually, the brain is strong in this sense.
The brain is strong. The brain is strong. the vagina is stronger, and relationships are resilient. So if you really target sort of like the trifecta, people can have very happy, fulfilling, loving sexual relationships into their menopause.
I can imagine a lot of listeners are listening to this and they're like, okay, I never thought about any of this. What are the questions that you'd suggest they should be sort of asking themselves to be sort of curious about, I guess, like their own needs and their own situation that might help them to understand what they want to do next?
I always ask patients first and foremost, does this bother you? Because if it doesn't bother you, then I don't really have anywhere to go. It has to be a problem for you. That's actually part of the diagnosis of, our hypoactive sexual disorders. It has to be a problem for the patient. And if it is, to really take stock on the different cultural, psychosocial, emotional triggers that are precluding her from wanting to move forward with intimacy with her partner. You have to be very sort of honest about that, because sometimes it requires an investment in counseling. It requires an investment in your body. It requires an investment to do some really serious inter-partner work in order to make sex and intimacy exciting again.
As Zoe's chief scientist, I want to talk about something that's just not talked about enough: menopause symptoms. As a perimenopausal woman experiencing menopause symptoms, I'm really excited that at Zoe, we've just launched the Menoscale calculator. This allows you to measure the number of symptoms that you have, but also the impact that they have on your quality of life. And this is a real game changer, I think. As a perimenopausal woman myself, we're all discussing amongst my friends the kind of symptoms we have, how they impact our life. But it's really difficult to actually quantify this. And now for the first time ever, there's a calculator out there that I'll be sharing with my friends that allows us to quantify just how big an impact our menopause symptoms are having on us. For the first time, we can measure it in this free-to-use resource so that we can start thinking about what we can implement in order to change it. The Menoscale calculator puts our science in your hands. Go to zoe.com/Menoscale to get your score. The calculator is free and only takes a couple of minutes. As we scientists say, if you can't measure it, you can't change it. All right, back to the show.
Thank you so much, Kameelah. I think that's really powerful, and I'm going to make Sarah relieved by moving on now to talk about sleep. What's the lived experience of patients coming in to you and their experience around sleep and how it's affecting them?
Usually I see issues with sleep as it relates to vasomotor symptoms, aka hot flashes or flushes, waking them up at night. They're sleeping soundly and then they get this wave of heat followed by chills, and it keeps them up for the rest of the night. It disturbs their sleep, and so they're just up. I get patients who just have a hard time falling to sleep in the first place. And so for me, that also begs questions about their partners who may or may not have sleep apnea and snore, and that interrupts their sleep. But the vasomotor flushes are probably the primary thing that wake women up at night.
And what are the biggest sort of myths around sleep at this time?
People are often afraid to advocate for their partner to fix something. Again, sleeping with a partner who tosses and turns or has sleep apnea, it's not fair that my sleep suffers because you have sleep apnea and refuse to see the doctor or get on a machine. That is a big thing. The other thing is weight gain. One of the misconceptions is that weight gain can actually affect your sleep. So it's important to recognize that even a 10, 15, even more, can cause you yourself to have sleep apnea. It can cause changes in your throat. Lower estrogen can also cause changes in your throat for some people, and that affects sleep as well. So those are the
You've mentioned the word sleep apnea a few times. Could you just explain what that is?
Sleep apnea is basically when there are intermittent disruptions to your sleep flow, your breathing, and often people can stop breathing in the middle of the night. We see this a lot of people who have that a really deep snore.
That was a good snore, by
That
the
was
way.
a good one. Listen, I have a partner who's been kicked out of bed many times, so I know it. And so the apneic part is when you literally stop breathing. That can affect your health. It leads to hypertension, cardiovascular disease. So these are important
and
things
that might
to know
get
about.
worse through
Can
menopause.
get worse. Mm-hmm.
And Sarah, I know that in your studies, like sleep has been one of the things that you've been measuring in these very large populations. What do you see?
So firstly, we see sleep, as Kameelah said, is a huge problem during the perimenopause transition and also postmenopausally. But interestingly, we know that sleep is related not just to the fact that, oh my God, I feel knackered the next day. It actually controls a lot to do with...
That means tired for the
Knackered?
American. Yeah.
Knackered. But if we're sleep deprived, not only do we feel absolutely exhausted, which is what knackered means, the next day, but it also impacts our choices. It impacts our brain. It impacts also how we process food. And we've seen this from our own ZOE Predict research. So what we know is that if you've had a poor night's sleep versus when you have a good night's sleep, how you metabolize the food is different. So for example, we see that if you have a high carbohydrate breakfast, if you've had a poor night's sleep, you have a really unfavorable blood sugar response compared to if you've had a good night's sleep.
So like your blood sugar spikes more if you've had bad sleep.
You have a big increase. What we also know is if you've had a poor night's sleep, it also heightens the reward centers in your brain. And so these reward centers are seeking out quick fixes. And so instead of if you've got your very healthy breakfast in front of you, so your style breakfast versus the less healthy breakfast, like a croissant or whatever, the reward centers need that quick fix. They want that carbohydrate fix. They want to suddenly feel great. So you're waking up exhausted. You're selecting bad food, or you're having to fight against the desire for the bad food, and then you're having these worse blood sugar responses.
That's quite a bad cycle then. So the bad sleep means that you're sort of being pushed towards the worst food, which is going to make your health worse and probably affect your bad sleep. And so I think your data, Sarah, also talks about the way that your diet itself can affect how strong these symptoms are. Is that right?
In terms of the menopause symptoms,
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've looked cross-sectionally. So we've looked at one point in time from our ZOE health studies in tens and thousands of individuals at their diet quality. So we've used a tool called a food frequency questionnaire where we ask them questions about all different types of foods that they eat. And then we've looked at how many symptoms they have and how severe these symptoms are. And what we find is people that have a higher diet quality have a significant reduction in the prevalence of the symptoms. So for example, up to 20 to 30% less people report sleep disturbances, hot flushes, etc. Now, it's really important, Jonathan, at this point to say that is for an overall healthier diet. There is no silver bullet out there, though, dietary silver bullet that's going to stop symptoms or really significantly reduce symptoms. And in the UK, there's a real problem with what we call meno washing. I don't know if you have this here, where, you get a supplement, you stick meno in front of it. You get a skincare product, you stick meno in front of it. You get a hair shampoo, you stick meno in front of it. You can double the price that you're charging, and then you make all of these promises that, it will cure that hair loss, it will make your skin, you'll look 20 years younger, and take this supplement and you'll sleep better, you won't have a hot flush, etc. Unfortunately, there's no evidence to support any of these claims, and it's $1 billion industry. And it's increasing exponentially each year, this industry. And that's what's quite worrying, where actually a basic, healthy, balanced diet will help to a certain extent. It's not going to stop the symptoms, but can help reduce some of these symptoms.
I was just going to say, I'm so excited sitting here right now. And I think that's what's so fascinating about menopause is it is so multifactorial and complicated that it's just really a magnificent area of life to study. And I will say, from a clinical perspective, when women come in and they hear the words that you just spoke, I give to them, we got to clean up this, this, and this, and they do it, when they really invest in themselves and do it, oh my gosh, doc, I'm sleeping. Oh my gosh, this weight is coming off. It is just really exciting to me that we were talking earlier about how we have all these intangible, subjective, hoity-toity kind of ways of that science doesn't respect. Now you have the objective clinical data to support what we're seeing.
And I think what's also really relevant here is the point that you said is also interrelated. one thing affects the other. The sleep also makes us feel tired, so we don't exercise. So we're not getting the physical activity. So we're also maybe not improving our bone health. We're not improving, our maintenance of a healthy weight, etc. It's like this kind of domino effect. And that's what makes it so challenging, because you get in this vicious circle of, well, I've put the weight on. What can I do about it? Oh, what's the point then of doing this, and this, etc.
But you can always change.
Yeah,
you can always
totally.
pivot.
So I'd actually love to switch to that. At the back end of the podcast, we always like to sort of switch to talking about the actionable advice that people can take. And I do think that, talking about menopause can often seem quite depressing. Like it's a sort of freight train bearing down on half the population that you can't avoid, right? You're like stuck on the tracks. Like when you think about reclaiming your health, what are the things that you have in mind? And then together, I'd love to explore some of the practical things that you could be talking about doing.
Yeah. So again, this is a generalization, but I love menopause and the perimenopausal transition because for many women, not all, but many women have completed their childbearing. Their kids hopefully are old enough to be a little self-sufficient. This is a time where I'm like, girlfriend, let's get selfish. Let's take back time when we come home from work to invest in ourselves. Let's, have the kids do something and you take 10 minutes for yourself, 15, 20, and then you slowly build up to work out. You don't have to leave the house. You don't have to do anything crazy, but just use that time to invest in yourself, whatever it is. Is it a workout? Is it a longer bath time? Is it reading a book at night? Whatever it is, I usually encourage women to use this time to be selfish and self-caring. And I know that word it's like so overused, but when you really take it to heart and start to manifest, just like, the menopause could be a freight train, so can this self-love and indulgence be a freight train in your life so that you can start to get back on track. So we talk about tangible things. Cook your own dinner, make your own salad. What is it at any moment of the day that you can do to make the best decision for yourself?
We don't have to go from, nothing to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is something that we often make the mistake of thinking that, I've got to do half an hour exercise every day. I've got to, totally eliminate ultra-processed food and all, refined carbohydrates. Actually, just a tiny change can have a big impact. It's about building that habit. And there's a term that is used a lot now called exercise snacking. And I love this term. And it's about just as and when you can fit it in, do an exercise snack. So that could be just, when the kettle's boiling, just do 10 squats while the kettle's boiling. While your Zoom meeting is loading, again, do a few squats or wall pushers, etc. You can fit in however busy you are. And it's just getting that as part of your daily habit.
Does that matter? Does exercise have any impact on the things we're talking about today?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, jinx.
Jinx, I know. Absolutely. And you taught me that term last night, which I love. Most of us can't jump in. When I started working out, I have 3 kids. When I lost 45 pounds, when I jumped back into working out, I thought I was going to die. There was just no way I could complete a 40-minute workout. And I did. I had to start really slow. And, people kind of chuckled at the old lady in the back of the class. But it just took time, consistency, and just little steps. And it absolutely makes you feel better. The weight starts to come off. And again, you don't have to go from 0 to 100.
But this can make a significant, because we talk about exercise a lot to do with sort of long-term health.
Oh, weight
It can
bearing.
really make a difference to the way that you're experiencing this menopause change.
Building muscle, your bone health is critically important. Weight-bearing exercises, strength training, checking in on your posture and balance is absolutely critical for women as they start to age. We see increased risk of osteoporosis, osteopenia, which is a weak bone, and then fall risk. Fall risk is huge when we aren't doing weight-bearing exercises and balance, so absolutely.
And I think the peri-postmenopausal transition phase is the particularly most important time to be doing these weight-bearing exercises. And, you can do little things like you're standing in a queue at the supermarket, balance on one leg. That's using your muscles.
Can I just clarify? Because I think you're saying very strongly it's going to make a huge difference to your risk of breaking bones and things when you're older.
When you're older.
What about the actually the sort of symptoms we've been talking about today, whether that's sleep or intimacy, can exercise actually affect how you're feeling, or is this really about reducing, these very serious longer term risks?
It's both, because depending on who you are and when you exercise, aerobic exercise can help with your sleep. So it's usually recommended that you exercise more in the morning as opposed to the evening, which may activate you and make sleeping more challenging. But aerobic exercise in the morning has been associated with better sleep.
And also, we know that physical activity improves mental health. There's so much evidence around that. We also know that physical activity helps with weight maintenance. Whilst it might not be the most effective way to lose weight, we know it's really important in maintaining a healthy weight. We know that during the menopause transition, that's a really difficult time for women to maintain weight. Suddenly their weight changes, where their weight is on their body. They change from being what we call an apple shape, around their hips. It's then distributed around your tummy, which we know is particularly unfavorable in terms of long-term health. By exercising, that's enabling you to a certain extent, obviously you have to balance that with diet as well, to maintain your weight as well.
And so the exercise can help to reduce the extent to which the weight is sort of moving from sort of the periphery to around your belly, or did I mishear that, Sarah?
So a couple of things happen in terms of our body weight during the menopause transition. So estrogen is involved in where we deposit fat and how much fat we deposit. Estrogen very simply directs fat around your hips in women. When you lose estrogen, then it's directed then around your abdominal, your tummy area, which we know is very kind of metabolically active.
Yes, I remember we did a podcast with a scientist just focusing on this.
Hence why, it's particularly unfavorable for health. Now, it's not going to change that because you've lost estrogen or you're losing estrogen. But what also happens is you're more inclined to deposit fat, full stop. And so what we know is that by maintaining physical activity levels, you can maintain a healthy weight if you're balancing that with a good diet as well.
Now I know that talking about estrogen replacement is a very large topic, but I feel that we can't have this conversation without touching on it a little bit, because it feels like it's clearly one of those conversations that everybody has that's going through it. How can that affect both intimacy and sleep that we've been discussing? And I'm sure this is a conversation you must be having with your patients all the time.
Yes, and I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet, because it's important that people understand the difference. So when we think about hormone replacement therapy, it depends on a few things. If you're a candidate, meaning age, risk factors such as smoking, heart disease, diabetes, etc. Hormone replacement therapy, traditionally, we're talking about estrogen, and if you have a uterus, also progesterone. Hormone replacement therapy, typically our party line is that we're using it for the hot flashes, vasomotor symptoms. We want to use the lowest dose for the least amount of time, understanding that everyone is an individual and sometimes we have to make exceptions and people are on it for longer or shorter amounts of time. What I would say in relation to intimacy is hormone replacement therapy is not the same as when we use estrogen in the vagina, which is specifically for vaginal dryness, or we call that vaginal atrophy, which helps with pain associated with sex. So those are different things, but in general, hormone replacement therapy can help the hot flashes, which then help people sleep, mental clarity, and they're more productive.
And we also see in our own research women taking HRT, and this is transdermal HRT in the UK. So this is the patches or the gel, which is the main form of HRT that we prescribe in the UK. That from our own research, those taking HRT versus not taking HRT tend to have a lower blood pressure. They tend to have lower blood cholesterol, better insulin sensitivity, and lower inflammation as well. So there is some suggestion that taking HRT may reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. But we've only just started transitioning to this transdermal, this skin form of HRT. So we need to see if this actually plays out in the long term as a real beneficial effect.
Right. So many people came off of HRT after the Women's Health Initiative. We were all scared of hormones, and now we know that that was a mistake. And so here, and probably other places, we start initially with like oral medication, hormone replacement therapy. And then around 51 is usually our standard that we do transfer to this transdermal. It is primarily because it has a safer cardiovascular profile as it relates to causing like pulmonary embolism or heart attack. And so women should talk to their doctor about it, but I don't worry about it. And I find that the lifestyle and the life quality improvement is great. I think we're going to see that translate into our studies.
But I think anyone having a discussion with their doctor, and it's really important to say, I am not clinically qualified, that there is reasonable evidence showing the difference in the impact on health of the oral, so that's taking a tablet, versus the transdermal, the skin. And I think there is certainly better evidence for a more favourable impact from the transdermal than the oral.
So could we switch maybe to talking about diet now? Because I think I was really shocked to hear that diet could have any impact on menopause symptoms. Like, it seemed a bit, magical thinking. But Sarah, you have a really big study and some real data, and this is all a bit sort of fresh off the press. Could you share what your research shows?
Yeah, so as well as the cross-sectional data that I talked about earlier, so that data where we asked at one point in time, what are your symptoms, what's your diet? We've recently completed some analysis at ZOE where we asked people before they started the ZOE program, and then after they had gone on the ZOE program, which is all about healthy eating, plant diversity, eating according to your individual biology as well. We asked them, what's your symptoms like before? What are your symptoms like after? And what we found was that those who, following the ZOE program, had a significant improvement in many symptoms after they'd followed the ZOE program, after they had improved their diet. And I think that was really encouraging to see, not just that point in time, because obviously when we collect any information about someone's diet at one point in time, there's lots of what we call confounders. Is it that there's less smokers? Is it that they're more physically active that might be impacting results? But having this, what we call longitudinal data, where we followed them up and seeing an improvement, was really encouraging. Again, this is about overall healthy dietary patterns. Again, it's not about one single silver bullet. And we don't actually understand all of the mechanisms behind this. And I think this goes back to the point you said, Kameelah, earlier, that it's so multifactorial. Is it that the diet's helping with sleep? Is it that, having the better diet's impacting, your mental health? We don't know. And this is something we hope to really start to unravel with all of the data we're collecting at ZOE as well.
I think it's incredibly exciting, right? Because there's a lot of people coming to, to ZOE, coming to be members because going through perimenopause and menopause is like this big shock. Everything changes, their body changes, they feel like they're eating the same food, but all of this stuff is different from before. And we know from these studies, right, Sarah, that it's true. Like, women's bodies really are changing a lot in terms of how they respond to food. But this new data about how it's changing your diet through ZOE is actually having an impact on symptoms is really exciting. Yeah. Not something we expected at all 5 years ago, right?
Absolutely not. And I think there's going to be even more exciting stuff, I think, that we're going to start to unravel. We're already seeing hints that maybe time-restricted eating, will improve some menopause symptoms. There's so many other areas that we're looking at. And I think it's really exciting because hopefully as we unravel this further, there's so many tools in the toolbox that, people can choose what works best for them.
There were a lot of questions to do with sort of heart health, sort of cardiovascular risks, because it's the leading cause of death for women. In the US.
Yes.
And I think there's evidence that there are links, Sarah, between sort of this gain in weight around the belly and links to this. Like, what's going on? And is there anything specifically, again, that women should be thinking about through this period?
So I think it's really clear from our research and other published research that there's loads of different, what we call intermediary risk factors that change during the menopause. So your blood pressure, your underlying levels of inflammatory markers, which we know underpin many chronic diseases, your insulin sensitivity, so your glucose control, your blood cholesterol, where you deposit the fat. And there's quite nice data that's come out recently looking in age-matched individuals, whether you're pre or post-menopause, or what your overall risk of cardiovascular disease is, and then also following people up over a period of time and looking at how likely it was for you to have some sort of cardiovascular event like a heart attack or a stroke. And even if you're age-matched, If you're postmenopausal, because of all of these changes that have occurred in your body, you're about 20 to up to 40% higher risk.
20 to 40% higher.
Higher risk.
So it's a huge increase.
In terms of cardiovascular disease, yeah.
And from a clinical perspective, I start talking to patients about this very early because it's, again, a slow change. Behavior change is slow. And so I like to talk about it early so that they understand that menopause is exactly what you mentioned. It's a shift in your metabolism, a shift in your weight distribution. So we need to start attacking these issues now. And even when we talk about hormone replacement therapy that we don't use for the treatment of cardiovascular disease, but we are starting to see that there are benefits related to especially transdermal that can help women long term. So again, with this just being so multifactorial, we would be remiss to not really acknowledge that when women come to the GYN, they're worried about their cervical cancer risk, their breast cancer risk. But I remind them the number one thing in this country and other places that's going to get you is heart disease. And so it's critical that we are doing everything we can to prevent death from heart disease.
And we had some interesting data, Jonathan, from the ZOE Predict study where we looked at men and we looked at women across different ages. And what you saw with men in terms of lots of these intermediary risk factors, such as blood pressure, such as cholesterol, such as inflammation, they have just a steady increase. Each year they age, they have quite a steady increase. With women, we saw that premenopausal, they were sitting a lot below men in terms of many of these risk factors.
So much lower risk than men.
So much lower risk, whether it be blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. And they were gradually increasing with age. And then they get to the menopause and suddenly they shoot up.
Through the roof.
They catch up with men. And in some of these, they actually overtake men. And it's interesting. We published a paper on this. And it's a really nice, when you see it visually, it's like, wow.
Yeah.
You've suddenly got this kink in the curve.
And that's why it's just such an exciting time and such an exciting life event because you realize the power of estrogen and how it affects all of your body systems. You know, we see it a little bit in pregnancy, how estrogen affects women and preeclampsia, et cetera. But now to see that shift in menopause and just really recognize how important this hormone is, it's fascinating work.
But I think, Jonathan, you wanted me to be positive today, and I will be positive. What's really great is cardiovascular disease is primarily underpinned by diet. So yes, estrogen plays a role. Yes, we know there might be some genetic component, etc. But actually, we know that we can contribute to the reduction of cardiovascular disease risk hugely by modifying our diet. So by eating healthy types of fat, reducing, many animal-based saturated fat, by having a diversity of plant-based foods, by including kind of polyphenol-rich foods, by including fermented foods in our diet, by reducing our intake of refined carbohydrates, adding other healthy oils into our diet. There is so much we can actually do through diet to reduce risk. And so again, I think it's a really good point in time to think, well, am I doing enough? What else can I do, to mitigate this reduction in estrogen?
I love all of that. I mean, one final thing which I would like to spend a long time on, and maybe Kameelah, we can come up a whole nother podcast, but you've spoken about how factors like race and ethnicity create different levels of risk, I think particularly around bone health, I've heard you say, but elsewhere. What should our listeners know about that as they're considering sort of prevention and treatment?
In this country, at least, we see that race and ethnicity and access affects us on every level of our life. And so when I'm thinking about a patient as an individual and what her risks are, it's important that I actually incorporate race and her socioeconomic status and her experience as we develop health plans for her. So with my white Caucasian patients, we talk about their increased risk for bone health, bone disease, osteopenia, osteoporosis. My African-American patients, we talk about the lifestyle changes that need to be made in terms of mitigating the risk of diabetes, hypertension, food choices. And so I think that rather than running away from these questions of race and ethnicity, that they actually can be a fabulous tool for us to, as doctors, to individualize care for patients within their own cultural context. So it's important that we have a degree of cultural sensitivity and understanding and discussion, because when we're looking at every level of impacting a person's life, their melanin informs that.
And also, I think symptoms are different. We know, for example, that East Asian populations tend to have significantly less hot flushes or hot flashes. And we actually are starting to understand why. And it's really fascinating because the East Asian populations have particular microbes in their microbiome that can convert particular food chemicals into a very active chemical that binds to estrogen receptors. And so in the UK, in the US, only about 20% of people can produce this kind of byproduct, which is called equal. Yet in East Asian populations, about 50% of the population have these microbes that can produce equal.
And as a result, fewer of them are having these
and have
symptoms.
significantly lower hot flushes.
It's amazing.
And
So
flushes.
another example of how those bacteria really make a difference to our health. I'm guessing that everyone now wants that bacteria.
Yeah, and we're only just at the stage of working all of this out.
Amazing. Well, I better wrap up so that you can go and deliver a baby into the
you.
world,
It's a
which is
little
definitely
girl.
more exciting. I would just like to do
Thank
a
you.
quick summary, and please keep me accurate because this is a lot of topics we haven't really talked about before. We start off by saying that, one way to look about menopause might be like it's a freight train, but another way is to say that actually this is an opportunity to revisit your life. Maybe your kids are a bit older, like your situation's a bit different. There's a set of things that maybe you can do now that were hard. So you can think about that positively. So there were two particular areas we talked about. The first was around intimacy. And I think what you explained is like estrogen is everywhere. And so it affects everything from the brain, which you described, I think, as sort of a woman's biggest sexual organ, through to your vagina and everywhere else. And so there are real changes that can happen to a woman's body going through menopause. This drop in estrogen can make sex painful. That's clearly obviously have a big impact on whether a woman wants to have sex. And then there's all these other changes that are going on about how you feel. So I think Sarah would talk about, which is also likely to affect how you could consider intimacy. So there's a lot of things that are sort of lining up to make intimacy less appealing. I think you said it's only relevant if the woman actually wants to have more intimacy. So starting with that point, if you do, I think there's a very positive message. There's actually quite a lot you can do. And that includes that you said there are medical treatments that you've seen work, but also there's a lot of things that you can do, going back to this idea that your brain is sort of the biggest source of this intimacy, where you can change that. So again, it's not a sort of one-way terrible story. There's a lot of positivity, and it looks to me, you're sort of suggesting you've had a lot of success with people coming into your clinic. And the second thing we talked about is sleep, which is above all disturbed because of these hot flashes that are happening because of this absence of estrogen. That then wakes you up. You can't then go back to sleep. There's then this horrible chain of effect that Sarah was explaining about, everything from you wake up and you want to eat more of the food that's worse for you. You then metabolize it worse, so it hits you worse. You put on more weight, and then makes you sleep worse. So again, like sort of not very cheering circle. And then Sarah, I think you explained that diet can really make a difference here, both in terms of reducing these symptoms, including hot flashes, but sort of across the board, and they can improve how you're feeling now as well as your long-term risk. And so for you, one of the things you can do, seeing with this data now, which is sort of quite surprising, is you can really make a difference to not just your long-term health, which I think everybody knows, but really make a difference to your menopause symptoms by tailoring this diet towards something that's better for you. We, of course, talked about hormone replacement therapy. Historically, there's been a lot of people concerned about it, but that this can help with a lot of these symptoms, and that's a conversation you'll have with your doctor. That exercise isn't just about like long-term health, which is obviously very important, including things like bone density, but actually, again, it can make a difference to these symptoms through menopause, including the sleep. So there's something you can really do. And then I think we talked a little bit at the end about how understanding sort of ethnicity and race is also something important to understand. How do you tailor this to an individual? With, I guess, the final summary that there is actually this opportunity to step back and rather think about this as, it's all terrible, as, okay, what are things that I can maybe now take on board that might have been very difficult for me 10 years earlier that can actually push my life in a sort of healthier direction? I think that's the positivity, Kameelah, that you were talking about at the beginning and the end.
That was much more articulate than myself, but thank you.
Jonathan does great summaries.
That was great.
Well, I just play back after listening to what you said.
He's a good listener.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Thank you so much. I love the
Thank
fact that
you.
you're about to go and bring somebody new into the world.
We need an update to put on the
We'd like
show
to
notes
hear
for the podcast,
how it
please.
all went.
I will.
And really enjoyed that. And I hope that you'll come back and talk to us again in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate this. I learned so much. So thank you
we
for
did.
having me.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. I hope you learned something today and enjoyed the episode. If you listen to the show regularly, you probably already believe that you can transform your health by changing what you eat. But now, there is only so much you can learn from general advice on a weekly podcast. If you want to feel much better and live many more healthy years, you need something more. And that's why each day, more than 100,000 members trust Zoe to help them make the smartest food choices, so they could feel better now and enjoy many more healthy years. Combining our world-leading science with your Zoe test results, Zoe is your guide and coach to sustainable improvements to your health. So how does it work? Zoe membership starts with at-home testing to understand your unique body. Then, Zoe's app is your health coach, using weekly check-ins and daily guidance to help you shift your food choices so as to steadily improve your health. I rely on Zoe's advice every day, and truly it has transformed how I feel. So, to take the first step towards the possibility of more energy, less hunger, and more healthy years, take our quiz to help identify changes to your food choices you can make right now. Simply go to zoe.com/podcast, where, as a podcast listener, you can also get 10% off.